mean, at first, it started off as being a bit of a scary ride because the board was asked to make a decision about a very large pot of funding at its first meeting as a board. You know, I'm there as the Leeds Older People's Forum representative, but behind me stand many people and organisations to whom Leeds Older People's Forum is accountable. There's my team, there's the trustee board, but there's also a whole range of third sector organisations. So in terms of my role on the board, one of the really important things about for LOP, and I think all of the partners on the board, is being transparent and being accountable to the people and organisations that you represent. So with that in mind, then taking any decision or voting on anything, I'm then automatically thinking about how do I go back and make this accountable? For me, one of the positives about being on the board was at that first meeting, people from across the sectors said, we can't make this decision, we don't have enough information. And so that was quite heartening, because it could have been a situation where people who already knew that landscape quite well could have just said, well, yeah, we will fund X, Y, and Z. But actually, as a board, we took a collective decision, said, no, we need to go away, we need to have a lot more information, and we need to go and talk to the people we're accountable to see how they feel about these decisions. So that was actually quite heartening, and I think that was a really positive start for the board, because they had to make a collective decision about a large spend quite quickly. And so I think the fact that people were able to say no rather than go along with the process was a really positive start. You know, we're all working towards change and we're not there yet. So there are gaps, and I think it's to be expected that there are going to be gaps. On the one hand, there's the larger picture data about frailty in Leeds and how we understand it and interpret that, because the interpretation of data around frailty can work in all sorts of different ways. So it's really about understanding that bigger picture around frailty in Leeds and how the decisions we're making impact on the outcomes we've chosen to work towards and the impact on health inequalities around frailty. But then there's the information piece, which isn't just about data, it's also about the information that's coming forward in terms of project outlines, what projects are hoping to achieve, what the staffing requirements and so on. So it's actually quite a large and complex picture, the data and information. But since the board really first kicked off in October, I think it's come a long way in terms of the data and information that people in the background have been working on to have available to the board, and it's becoming more detailed and much more relevant. And so then as a board member and as someone who's not from an NHS background, that data and information is becoming more accessible and easier to digest and comprehend. And I think that's an ongoing work in progress, which I think everybody acknowledges as a board. When we come to looking at the role of less formal health and care for individuals living with frailty, then we also need to consider the qualitative aspects of that, because one of the key roles of the third sector is developing, if you like, the social wraparound support around health and care, delivered to people at home and in the community to enable them to live at home for longer and to remain engaged with family and friends and in their community. So it's really important not to lose sight of the importance of qualitative information to bring the hard stats to life, and to understand the impact of the less formal health and care on the lives of individuals and their abilities to remain independent and engaged. When we first started looking at which projects we'd fund as part of the virtual frailty ward, and I think this is an example of a positive direction of travel for the board. We were presented with a dispersed range of projects, some of which were quite well worked up and others weren't. And which could, you know, which all seem to sort of mix together, but weren't necessarily framed as being within the virtual frailty ward. but a lot of that information was incomplete. So people had to go away in some instances and rework those projects up. The information came back and it was much more detailed. It was much easier to see where we could make decisions, both as individual representatives and the collective as a board, because then it was much clearer about what outcomes the projects were achieving in terms of frailty, what the staffing and recruitment issues were, what the outcomes and outputs were going to be. So it's those sorts of things that are really important, and particularly things like staffing at the moment, because it's so difficult across all of the sectors. So I think the project specs became much more defined. And then as we've progressed, a range of projects sit more fully within this umbrella of a virtual frailty ward. And so it's much easier to see now how different projects fit in to the overall concept of the virtual frailty ward around delivering services in the community. Whereas before, that wasn't as fully realised as it is now. And I think that's an ongoing work in progress. That is one of the things about languages and different sectors speaking different languages, because that's how you get on in your daily work. And one of the challenges has been how we share and understand what it is we're trying to do. So, concepts like virtual frailty ward, if you're not from health, or you're not from the council, or not from a third sector organisation who's been involved in developing that or discussing it, then what on earth does that mean? But then also, how do you go back and discuss and share with your representatives what it is the Frailty Board is doing? And I think the Frailty Board is getting there in terms of challenge. I think, again, that's ongoing and it's a work in progress. The third sector matters to the whole of the health and care sector. It's really, really important. But yet there's further work for the third sector representatives and wider system supporters to do to ensure that the role of the third sector is fully represented. So in terms of my role as a third sector rep on the board, in terms of making decisions around spend, there's been very few third sector projects. They are mainly NHS funded projects or projects developed in partnership with the council with some third sector funding, but not very much. So that's quite a funny position to be in sometimes as a third sector rep. And partly, the funding that's coming down from the NHS and is now starting to be directed through these population boards, then often that funding is quite restricted as to what it can be spent on. And I think that does ask wider questions about not the role of the third sector, but the funding of the third sector within health and care. A difference going forward would be funding coming via the new boards that recognises the work of all partners in the sector. Because if we are talking about one system, which has a focus on the person, and the aim is to move towards more person-centred services, then that has to recognise the role of all partners, the NHS, the council, and the third sector. And at the moment, that's not happening because of the funding and also because it's a work in progress. So that would be my wish, that actually the funding recognises the breadth of the work and how important that is to deliver a person-centred care, and that funding is allocated appropriately, and that the third sector doesn't remain a poor relation, because it currently still is, and that is ongoing. And I can't see that change happening very quickly, because you have to bear in mind there's never enough funding. It's going to be tight, but actually if we're really talking about supporting older people to remain at home, remain independent, then the role of community care and support cannot be overlooked in the way it still is being by the funding that's available. I think the really positive thing about the population board is that it's an inclusive board. I think the chair has a really inclusive style, which is a really important, I think the role of the chair is really important in the population boards. And I think the chair has fostered an atmosphere of cooperation and inclusion.